at the end is what is a person on the final test, test 3, for example. But it's not just that. I mean, are persons significant? What's our place in the universe? And how do I maintain that place? By the way, today we think of that primarily as a narrative exercise. So I need a story that explains to me why I get up in the morning, what my values are. My values are embedded in the story, I believe, explains why I'm here and what I should be doing, right? That's where my values come from. Of course, if we share those stories, belief in that story, and then we're going to share those values, and we're going to feel like a community. If we end up in competitive narratives, then of course we end up feeling like your enemy or someone that I can't trust, because literally, trust is what's essential for us to have that kind of community, etc. Is that part of a liberal arts education? We're of course arguing over that today. A lot of people feel like STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math, right, are the main subjects that people should study in school. But those do help you, of course. My son is a civil engineer. He got his civil engineering degree here at UAA many years ago, and went off and that week got hired as an engineer for a firm downtown, making way more money than I've ever made. Still there. So he did get bored, and he ended up studying art as well. And he got his BFA, and then he went to University of Arizona and got his MFA. And he came back here and he taught art at UAA for a semester or two and got bored with it. And so now he's back being an engineer. That makes sense? But by the way, that's important. If you email me, make sure you put the S, W-S-J-A-M-I-S-O-N. If you just put W-J-A-M-I-S-O-N, you're emailing him. I don't know why. The university just, well, his name is William, so. We're also learning the craft of a free people, etc. So there are key issues to interpreting the text. They are ancient, the ones we start with, but even the contemporary texts are difficult to understand. We have to interpret them. And interpretations are neither true nor false. So that's pretty interesting. Okay. So let me move further down. Okay. So I'll start off talking about the pre-Socratics. That's all right? Yes? So the pre-Socratics, those that were prior to Socrates, since we think of philosophy as primarily a Greek-started subject, because Philosophia is Greek, right? And we can argue that it was the beginnings of a particular type of subject. It's pretty clear that a lot of what the Greeks thought actually came from the Egyptians. Because we could go and study the Egyptians and discover, yes, they seem to have a lot of interesting ideas and so on. And there's even arguments that the different Greek philosophers took some of what they thought from the cultures further south. Right? But when we look at Thales, which means water, was the first philosopher and also considered to be one of the wise men of Greece. There were 7, apparently. But he's famous for doing some dumb things, like falling into a well because he's looking at the sky. By the way, I looked that up, and it turns out that arguably what he was doing was deliberately getting into the well to test a theory that even in the daylight you could see the stars if you were in a deep enough well. That doesn't work, so you don't have to do that. So I don't think he actually fell into the well, even though that might have seemed what happened to people. But Thales is considered to be the first philosopher. He is from Miletus, which is a Greek colony in Turkey. And the reason they think of him as the first philosopher is because he asked a question, and that is, what is the arche? Arche, A-R-C-H-E in English. It's a Greek word that means the basic building block. And notice that it's the root of archaeology, architecture, arch, holds a lot of shapes in architecture up. So arch, or arche, right? So the basic building block. And he argued that it was water. I think that's why his name was Thales, because he's famous for saying it was water, right? Thalo. Right? I've seen that word mean other things too, like I want to die, which, I'm not sure that's the same as water. But in any case, that's kind of like contemporary physicists in trying to figure out what are the basic building blocks, the arche of the universe. And today, of course, we've got quarks and leptons and things of that, photon, all that stuff, right? Well, Thalo was about one generation. The very next generation was Anaximenes. By the way, the links I have on these all go to texts that include some of their writing, although they didn't write much. And it might not have been there. Most of the time it comes from Aristotle quoting them. And by the way, this whole line of progression is actually Aristotle's history of philosophy. So Aristotle is already giving us a narrative of development, progress in science, right? And pointing out that it all leads to him. So you might take all of that with a grain of salt, because obviously Aristotle is just showing how all of this development leads to Aristotle's philosophy. So that's fun. But Anaximenes argues that air is rarer than water, and so air has to come first. And water could be made from air. You could actually argue how that works. And then Anaximander comes up with the concept of the infinite, which gave everybody a headache. Because, if you have, a line from A to B, and you realize it's an infinite number of points from here to here, if you're trying to get from point A to point B, you have to first go half the distance. And to get to half the distance, you have to go half that distance, and then half that distance, and half that distance, and half, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, you can't actually get from point A to point B without going an infinite number of points, which you can never do. So that's a puzzle, right? There's also Zeno's paradoxes, where Achilles has a race with a tortoise, and it gives the tortoise a head start. And every moment after the tortoise sets off, Achilles covers half the distance between himself and the tortoise. But of course, each moment he covers half the remaining distance, half the remaining distance, half the remaining distance. Poor Achilles is never going to catch up to this stupid tortoise. It's kind of annoying. So these are mathematical puzzles that, by the way, are not actually solved. Aristotle argues that the problem is that you're using an infinite distance, but using a finite amount of time to cover the infinite distance. What you have to do is use both a finite distance and finite time, or an infinite distance and infinite time. As long as you do both, you're okay, right? I'm not sure if that actually solves the problem. I believe the problem of the infinity is really difficult, and in fact, one of my favorite books on it is Everything by David Foster Wallace. It is absolutely hilarious. And it's short, so that's fun. But it's hilarious. He's a great writer. He committed suicide. Ouch. That hurts, however.
Does it hurt? Does he feel
I loved his writing, and I thought he was fantastic, and I used him as an example for things, and then he killed himself. And I was like, what kind of example is that to hold up to, we should all be like, oh no, that's no good. Let's not do that.
teach you something, no?
Pardon?
What did it teach you though? Like,
Well, in a sense, what he was teaching his students is something that I try to teach mine. So that's scary. That the end result of learning all this stuff could be depression. Whoa. But that is an issue. A lot of people end up, they believe stuff. They have a narrative. They're all set. I did, right? Then you get into philosophy class and your narrative is beat to crap. Because somebody shows you that's all stupid. So you're depressed, right? And they give you a new one. Yes, I'm okay again. And then they beat that one to crap.
What is that, like an existential crisis?
My very first existential crisis was first grade. I went in, the nun teaching the class, there's 50 of us all lined up. And she goes around the class finding everybody's name, right? And there was one kid, William Jamison. And we're all just sitting there. No William Jamison. She kept trying to figure out who this William Jamison is. And she finally stopped and looked at me and said, "Are you William Jamison?" And I said, "No, sister, my name is Billy." And she said, "You're William." I went home and I told my mom. And my mom laughed at me and said, "You are William." I wasn't who I thought I was. Man. Okay. Heraclitus is from Ionia, which is kind of an island off from Turkey. Still there. Great place to build a house if you don't mind living in the sunshine. But obviously you all love living here, and so you wouldn't want to live there. It's crazy. But Heraclitus, by the way, these names all mean something in Greek, right? So you could look them up. But Hera comes from hour, like Hera, the goddess of time or order, right? The wife of Zeus, she's in charge of order, including matrimony, which really pisses her off because Zeus loves fooling around. It's not my fault. I mean, Zeus is like famous for taking on a disguise. I mean, he likes being things like, Leda and the swan. Every artist has to paint his own version of Zeus as a swan messing around with Leda. And some of them are pretty bad, so I would never show you this in class. Because some of them could be really racy.
oh my God.
So I don't want to get there. Oh, wait, sorry.
Call that good stuff.
Get rid of that. So Zeus, Hera is in charge of order, and matrimony is part of that, right? Even for the Greeks, they thought, hey, if men and women don't get married and stay married, then the society is screwed, right? Kind of interesting. Cleitus means to the glory of. So Heraclitus means to the glory of time. And there's variants on that. So Hercules, by the way, is supposed to mean the same thing, even though it's different.
Is
Right?
that why you see it as Heracles sometimes too?
Yes, well, I think there's the Latinized version and the Greek version. We're, as English speakers, we've inherited both Greek roots and Latin roots, which enables us to come up with two words that mean the same thing. So that when people are trying to learn English, they get very confused. But it's kind of neat because if somebody doesn't understand the Latin version of it, you could give them the Greek version and they might remember, they might know that one. So that's although they're not always the same. So for example, paradox is a Greek word that means para to doxa, things you gotta believe. So paradoxa, you've got two things you have to believe. And by the way, they don't work together. So there, right? So you end up with that kind of a problem, like the one and the many. The universe is one thing, but it's in many parts. That gives Greeks headaches, because if it's one thing, how can it be many things? Right? That doesn't work, right? So that's a paradox. But it's in Latin, we say dilemma. Because di means two, and lemma is a thing you have to believe. They use it in math too. It's like an axiom, dilemma, right? So dilemma. So, but dilemma and paradox are not exactly the same in English, even though the one is the Latin translation of the Greek. Okay. So Heraclitus uses fire as his arche. And that's kind of crazy because, of course, he's probably using it as a metaphor, and what he probably means, well, could be energy, in which case, wow, he's really kind of amazing. But if he's using it only as a metaphor, what he famously argues is that everything flows. Nothing, I mean, everything keeps changing. So famously, you can't step into the same river twice, because it's not really the same river the second time you step into it. So nothing remains the same. So everything is constantly in flux. And that really gets Aristotle upset, because Aristotle absolutely wants to categorize everything and give it its set location, right? And so Aristotle said, if you have to argue with Heraclitus, you're basically having to point out that he argues with himself, because he can't keep the same objects from, so everything changes. He's arguing with himself. So you just have to shoot him, basically, right? Anaxagoras argues that it's atoms, but he also argues that there's a universal mind that everything is. That kind of comes close to what we might think of the concept of God. Pythagoras is really famous. Everyone, I think, probably is familiar with Pythagoras' theorem, which he stole outright from the Egyptians, we now know, because we found the Egyptians, they had it thousands of years before Pythagoras, right? And he also came up with the table of opposites, the 10 opposites, which is kind of famous because that kind of defines the way we think about a lot of things, and you wonder why do we even have that? And it's cultural, because for example, the Chinese do not have those same opposites. But if you're looking at Pythagoras' table of 10 opposites, let's see. I keep forgetting I have. So finite, infinite, odd, even, one, many, right, left, rest, motion, straight, crooked, light, darkness, good, evil, and some include male, female. So female in the table was associated with evil and darkness, etc. It's interesting that Wikipedia cleared it out of there.
Hmm.
I remember that as being an issue. Pythagoreanism, and there he is, by the way. If you're familiar with a famous painting called The School of Athens, which I can actually show you that. By Raphael. And some of the examples on the web actually include a picture, so that as you click or you highlight a particular individual, the name of that individual comes up. So I don't know if I can make this any bigger, but there's this guy here. He's supposed to be Plato. And you can tell that because his hand is pointing up, because he's an idealist. Right? We also happen to know that the model for Plato is Da Vinci, because here's Raphael right here looking at us, right? And Raphael's mentor was Da Vinci in the studio, right? I don't know who this guy is, but he's Aristotle, and he's in brown color, you know, earth and water. So that's kind of cool. And Plato is carrying his book, The Republic, Politeia, right? And Aristotle's carrying his book on ethics. So that's interesting. And then all these other books. So this is Socrates, for example. This is Diogenes, the Cynic, and so on. So you can look them all up and find out who the heck they all are if you're interested. It's kind of, by the way, this whole painting is in the Vatican Library, and notice that this is an actual arch, and this is a door. You can see that, you know, this is the mural inside the arch, etc. It's just kind of neat. There's paintings in every single arch. His team, Raphael's team, did all of them. This one is supposed to represent reason, and on the other side of the library was faith, which was a picture of St. Paul in the prison being released by the angel. I don't know if you're familiar with that story or not. So that's pretty cool. But Pythagoras, getting back to Pythagoras, other things that he's famous for is the divided string theory, although there's more than one divided string theory, but this is the harmony one, where if you take a musical string, piano string, and you, well, just like a guitar, right? You hold the frets and you change the pitch, right? And it vibrates repetitiously, etc. So the harmonies, right? That was something that Pythagoras came up with. But his argument for the arche is to say that number is the arche. 1. So you initially have 1, and 1 represents air. Then when you have 2, now you have fire. When you have 3, now you have a shape that's fluid, so it would be water. When you have 4, now you have earth. So basically you end up with earth, air, fire, water, right? All of those as the arches, so that basically you have all these different elements all mixing with one another, but they're all based on the number 1. So it's all mathematical again, right? Parmenides gives us the paradoxa, and Zeno is one of his students. Empedocles, though, is the one that puts them all together and gives us fire, air, earth, water, earth, air, fire, water, whatever. Great name for a band, which you could have myself. Democritus gives us atoms again. An atom means uncuttable. A is the Greek prefix that means not, and tome means cuttable, so atom means uncuttable. And we still use it, but gosh, we figured out how to break them. So we really should have renamed them at that point, and we didn't. So atoms we break down into the subatomic particles, etc. And we could get into that if you want to look at the contemporary standard model. You could just look it up. There's lots of different pictures that you could use that kind of outlines them. The up, the down, the charm, the strange, the top, the bottom. Latest one that they found was the Higgs boson, right? You know the joke, the Higgs boson walks into the church, and the priest sees it and says, "Hey, you're not allowed in here." And the Higgs boson replies, "Well, without me, you don't have any mass." Roman Catholic joke, you know. Not that you have to be Roman Catholic to get it. That was a bad joke?
I like
Never use that again? Okay. I've been waiting 2 years to tell that joke. That's, nobody laughed. Gosh. No, I just heard it like 2 weeks ago. Okay. All right. Back to, no. Okay. So I didn't mean to suggest that Thales and the others were not religious, because the Greeks had their religion at the time, and so this was kind of a parallel thinking apparently. Everyone figures that they absolutely sacrificed to the gods. Remember, they had the pantheon of gods, right? Pan means all and theon, gods, right? So you've got all these different gods. The Romans did too. Remember, they even have a pantheon in Rome, which is all the gods with the eye of God up at the top, right? It's, I think, one of the buildings in the Da Vinci Code, if you saw that movie, right? Where they are looking for the statue that's going to be the next statue where the bishops are going to be killed or something. I forget. Okay. Well, that's all just fun. So there, there's definitely religion involved. But there are also teachers that hire for money that are called knowledge teachers. Sophia, remember, Sophia means wisdom, knowledge, right? So these teachers are sophists, right? And they teach for money. And the people that they teach are the rich sons, the sons of the rich people, for the most part. Probably so. There were some women that actually also got to study and so on. Diotima, for example, was famous for being Socrates' teacher. So if you find that interesting. Diotima. Shoot, I'm at 9:15. What time are we supposed to go to now? Okay, so I did give you 2 quiz questions. Remember, email me those before next week. How many people hate the class already? I'm trying to make sure. I want you guys to like me, so if you don't like something I did or said, let me know, and I'll apologize. I love Forrest Gump. Any questions?
What's your address?
My MOS, 98 Gulf. 98 Gulf. well, 45 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
That was over an hour ago.
I want to introduce myself.
I should clarify.
Cable?
I don't actually live
I
by
don't
the mall.
even- no, I do
just
get
asked
cable.
because I look at
You know, you get that all the time.
That's all the time.
You always have cable with me.
Do you have a code?
I do.
And I know you're probably.
So when I left,
Digger?
I would.
when I walked out,
No, when you said it, I just went on my
Were you
phone.
named it
when I
Honorable
left
St.
earlier,
Digger?
I walked out to go
Kind
start.
of, yeah.
So we would have.
It's a cool class. I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, cool.
That's
Very
fine.
highly
I
impaired.
do want everyone to like it, because otherwise you drop out, and then I get no money.
The wife doesn't get the money.
The wife doesn't.
Yeah.
Well, I don't get any money. But she lets me live there,
And you get food, so
and, well,
Sometimes.
I have to do all the shopping. I mean, she
That's-
doesn't
You can
go
always
out.
get what you want.
Prepare.
Well, I wanted to apologize for having excused myself so many times.
Oh.
Respect and
So I was
understanding.
over negotiating,
Since
so I was like,
2016.
Well, if you want, you can just come to the middle and just,
we'll see next week. If I'm in contract by next week, then yes.
That's true.
But that's,
is it a good house?
yeah,
Why are you selling
it's, no, I'm buying.
I just
Oh, you're
wanted to
buying
hear
it.
I wanted to hear that
Yeah.
quick in my head, I'm like,
Wait.
holy smokes.
We bought
That makes
ours
so
in
much sense
87.
why like
Okay.
We
0 and
saw it
5
first in
and
May, and
0
we put a
and
bid
5
on it,
and
and
0 and why
settled
every 5
in,
years is a year and why everything is like a 0 or a 5.
or no,
I
we
believe
settled
every 4
before
years
that,
is
like
like-
July was like the first month
I'm
when
not.
we were actually
So it's
in our,
2016.
we moved
Oh,
in
you're right.
within 20
You're
days.
right, so we were exactly
It was June.
Yes.
But we rented it for the first month while we were
So
still,
this is stuff I didn't pay attention to.
Oh, that's ideal.
I
and
understand.
that was because,
Yeah, I didn't
either.
the owner
That's
was
why
an
I
FBI
did the
agent,
other thing, I went out in the world first.
sold it, well, he was selling it because he was
really trying to make
transferred
the most
to
of it.
Tennessee.
Okay.
So they were on the highway in Canada negotiating with us as they were going.
Canada's no fun.
Well, thank you.
Well,
See you
but
next week.
thanks for letting me know, but I'm
Yeah.
okay, I'm okay.
Okay. I figured you were, but I just
I'm
wanted to
just-
also explain
I'm just
myself. That's
asking
not
you.
normal behavior for me to, yeah. So just to double check, so the quiz questions are due before
Next week.
class on Friday?
Yeah, because I like to read them and get a sense of, what people are thinking
Okay.
before I come into class and tell my next set of jokes.
Fair enough. Okay. Well, have a great night.
Oh, and I didn't tell everybody what to read,
Don't have to read them. No.
but the apology is, so, yeah, if you look at
Apology.
if you look at my notes, actually, see, it says January 24th. The very first thing we'll be discussing will be the apology. So remember, I'm giving you the links to the,
How do we get to this page again? Is
It's
it,
on
Okay.
Blackboard, so if you go to the Blackboard and then hit the syllabus link and then hit syllabus.
you could do that, or you could just, this is on the web,
Yeah.
so you could actually go right to
Okay.
any of these
okay. Awesome.
without having to go through Blackboard.
Okay.
Some of these links end up not working. I'll explain when that happens, because I'm not in control of those, actually.
Yeah.
So,
We'd love to be.
hello,
I'm Brittany.
Brittany,
I did
nice
have
to
a
meet you.
question. You mentioned that there would be, aside like the writings we have to do, are those posted yet? If so, where can I find them? If not,
Right,
how
so,
often will
so,
they?
so the quiz questions I'll ask each night,
Mhm.
and just email me your response. It doesn't have to be any certain length,
Okay.
whatever. You can say, I don't know them. Or you can have fun with it.
Good question.
It should be a pretty fun thing.
I feel like my parents would kill me if I didn't know them. 19 years of going to church, I better know something from them.
You could say that. That would be, great to hear, actually. So the exams are the first thing.
Okay.
There's test 1, test 2, test 3.
Okay.
And the dates that they're due is in the syllabus.
Okay.
So just before the due date, you can send it.
So we can turn them in at any time before the due date.
Right, and
Okay.
if you send in something, and then a couple classes later, you decide to change your mind because we talked about something, like talking about the Earth going around the, sun, or the sun going around the Earth. probably the way people in the class are thinking about that now is way different than it was at the beginning. Is that possible? So, you know, you might change your mind, so you could always just send more, which would be fine too. Because the more you write, yay for us, because that's improving your vocabulary use, you know, which is the goal of the course. So the more you write, the better. And I'm not gonna downgrade anybody, because I asked for 3,000 words and you gave me 9,000. That would be, oh my goodness, yay. Yay us, you're on your way to becoming a philosophy major. And you won't have to worry about ever earning any money ever again. 'Cause-
Good night.
Good night.
So all the quiz questions, etc., are they on the website?
They're not on the website, because I make them up as we go, but I will post them as a Blackboard.
All right, awesome.
Peace.
I hate Blackboard, but that's good to know.
Well, what I do is I post it as a, you know, like an update on Blackboard when you go to it, but I'll at the same time email it to you.
Okay.
So hopefully you'll be all set. Good?
Yes.
Fun first class?
I liked it, yes.
Yay, team.
I did actually have a joke, I just never got to tell it.
Oh, what is your joke?
So a lawyer goes to a farm looking for a horse. And he shows up, he goes around, he kind of kicks the tires, looks at all the horses, finds one, and it's beautiful. It's white with a couple of like black spots on it and a gray mane, but it's, you know, young and strong. And he's like, "This is a great horse." The farmer says, "I don't know, it doesn't look so good." The guy says, "What are you talking about? It's a beautiful horse. I want it." The farmer says, "The horse don't look so good." The lawyer says, "Screw this." He says, "You're just trying to, you know, get me to not take your best horse. I'll give you all this money for it." Throws down a bunch of money on the table. The farmer says, "I'm telling you, the horse don't look so good." The lawyer's just like, "Screw you." Buys the horse, leaves. Comes back 2 weeks later and says, "Why didn't you tell me the horse was blind?"
It doesn't look
So
good. Well, you know, it still might be a good horse. You just have to teach it to use a cane. Well, have a nice week.
You too.
Did you have a full turnout?
Pretty big class.
Did you had 31 or 33 scheduled?
Yeah, well, there were a couple that emailed me that weren't going to be able to come. So I'm thinking that those folks didn't come. I'll get their email quizzes, but I'll post the quizzes online so that those that weren't here could still